Amongst those watching this program, there may be one of you at least who knows or strongly suspects the person responsible.
His grim spree sparked the biggest police manhunt in history, yet the killer was never caught. And this was despite Scotland Yard putting their top detective on the case, the legendary John DeRose.
We hoped to start him up, to get him frightened, to make him run, to do something which would point the finger towards his guilt.
Lots of people put forward different theories about the identity of the killer, but frankly, only one really stands out. And if we could prove this theory, it has every possibility of delivering to the Metropolitan Police something that they didn't have 50 years ago, and that's a genuine prime suspect. The suspect in question's story begins 150 miles away in Abertillery in 1921. There are events that happened there almost 100 years ago that could hold the key to unlocking this mystery. A 15-year-old boy was convicted of a gruesome double child murder. And those murders have chilling parallels with the Hammersmith nude murders. But can those parallels be measured to build a convincing case that the boy killer went on to become a serial killer? Our search has been supported by a series of extraordinary interviews with the suspect's own daughter.
I couldn't believe it. I thought, my dad hasn't killed anybody. The man that I knew as my dad was a murderer.
All I want are some answers to an enduring mystery. Answers, moreover, that might take us one step forward to identifying the man that the press called Jack the Stripper.
Hannah Tailford's body, naked except for stockings and underclothes stuffed into her mouth, was found in the river. In April, the river cast up at Chiswick the nude, tattooed body of Irene Lockwood. She had not been dead for very long. The same month, a mile from the river, another tattooed prostitute, Helen Bartlemy, was found in Brentford. Acton again, July. Mary Fleming's body was dumped in a cul-de-sac. In the night, neighbours heard a car stop, reverse and roar away in panic. 4 months later, the tattooed body of Frances Brown was found in a car park. In the murder room at Shepherd's Bush, police have checked every date. But they have found enough similarities to convince them that the killings are the work of one man.
I remember watching this on the news as a child, and it really captured my imagination about the kind of person who'd be able to do this. At the time, the press kept comparing the killer to Jack the Ripper, but for me, that was in the distant past, and therefore Jack the Stripper seemed much worse, more sadistic, more calculating. And of course, like Jack the Ripper, he evaded capture. As a criminologist, I'm always interested in a serial killer's MO, his modus operandi. And the Jack the Stripper murders have a number of common factors which really intrigue me. All of his victims were sex workers. They were all diminutive in height. They had been stripped naked and had their teeth removed. And the bodies had been stored for some time before being deposited across West London. This wasn't a London that we would recognise today. Back in the 1960s, some parts of West London were a real rough and ready type of place with lots of women selling sexual services and men curb crawling seeking to buy those sexual services. It was a pretty grim and desperate lifestyle, and of course some of the women were beaten, were robbed, and of course for 6 women they would be picked up and go into a car with a man who would eventually kill them. Back in the 1960s, the press diminished the crimes and the women, choosing to concentrate on the more salacious aspects of their lives and their work so as to degrade them. Many of their children are still alive today, and they're still searching for justice.
Victim number 1, Hannah Tailford, a 30-year-old prostitute who originally came from Northumberland. On February the 2nd, 1964, her body was fished out of the Thames at Hammersmith.
Hannah Tailford was my birth mother. She had me in Exeter prison in July 1957. I remember seeing a newspaper article and the headlines were "Fun Time Girl Found in the Thames." So the general attitude towards them was, well, it's just a prostitute. It was a cheap life. So they would just see her as another trollop that was in the cafe having a coffee, or in the pub having the beer, trying to pull for the night. At the end of the day, whatever happened, she was a mum, and she did as best as she could in the situation that she found herself. Justice wasn't done at the time. I'd like them to open the case, find the evidence, maybe come up with closure and say, actually, it could have been this person here. Because the children that are out there, of all the women, all the mums that were murdered, you know, most of them had children and were still alive. And it would just give us proper, okay, justice has been done. You've named that person.
The Metropolitan Police mounted what still remains as one of the biggest manhunts in its history. Hundreds of officers were drafted in to hunt down the killer. But this huge combined effort came to nothing, forcing them to turn to new innovative means of getting the public and the killer's attention.
Amongst those watching this program, there may be one of you at least who knows or strongly suspects the person responsible. If so, I'm speaking directly and personally to you. There could rest on your conscience the possible death of yet another young woman. I appeal to you to come forward, and I can assure the utmost confidence and discretion to anything disclosed.
In one final desperate effort, they conducted tens of thousands of door-to-door inquiries across London. One door within this search area, which they very likely did not knock upon, was the home of an unassuming family man. But he was also a man who kept until his death a terribly dark secret from all who knew him, including his own family. For in his youth, he'd been imprisoned for murdering 2 young schoolgirls in the most brutal and sadistic way imaginable. And he was living at the epicenter of the Jack the Stripper murders. The first question I'm looking to answer is, how could such a man have escaped even being questioned? And could he have gone on to kill and kill again? And that man's name is Harold Jones. Harold Jones hailed from the Welsh mining town of Abertillery. He sadistically murdered 2 girls in 1921. I believe by revisiting and deconstructing their deaths at the hands of Jones, we have the precise starting point for discovering if he could have matured into a serial killer later in his life. The crimes, though almost 100 years old, continue to be felt by the community and family members even to this day. Visiting the girls' graves today are their nieces, Sue Lloyd and Shirley Swift.
But it's so pretty. It's so
It's a
pretty.
lovely. Is it like a? What's she holding? A rose or something? I would imagine. Is she in her hand? And the dress that she's wearing is what they used to wear then.
Yeah.
You know, those sort of clothes.
8-year-old Frida Bonnell had gone to a local shop running an errand for her father. She disappeared, only to be found dead in a back alley a day later.
They must have been absolutely devastated. I know it has affected my family throughout my life. You can't quantify it, can you? Because it was so unexpected, and certainly not in a community as the way that I have seen Abertillery over the years, that protects its own. So this to happen then must have been earth-shattering. They must have had no confidence, and your grandfather must have been, well, why he didn't have a nervous breakdown, I shall never know.
I think it did affect his health, you know, later on in life.
Yeah.
Because I don't think he ever forgave himself for sending her to the shop to do, you know, to buy some things for him. That's how it happened.
Buried a short distance from Frida is her friend, Florence Little. The 11-year-old was murdered after Frida Bonnell had been laid to rest. Florence's murder devastated Sue's family, which was torn apart by the tragedy. Florence's parents would eventually be buried with their murdered daughter.
Excuse me a minute. She's not on her own. She's got her mum and her dad. I mean, it might be sentimental, but they're there with her, trying to protect her now the way they couldn't on that particular occasion.
The twin murders devastated the community and made headlines all over the world. Local people were convinced the killer must be an outsider, but the arrival of detectives from Scotland Yard found the answer much closer to home in the form of 15-year-old shop assistant Harold Jones, the last person to have seen both girls before they disappeared. Could Harold Jones really have gone on to become Jack the Stripper? Local historian Neil Milkins certainly believes so, having researched the story and lived in the town where the killer's spectre still looms large.
It's a part of the history of Abertillery. You can't get away from that. It's the murder of 2 little girls, which astounded the community then, and it's still a sensitive subject, although 97 years have passed.
Harold Jones was sentenced to 21 years in prison for his crimes. But Neil's interest in Jones didn't end with his imprisonment. He was intrigued to learn what happened to him upon his release, particularly given a chilling claim he made to a prison psychiatrist.
He was let out of prison in 1941 against the recommendations of a number of professional people within the prison service. He told the prison authorities, "I do not want to lose the desire to kill." And that was shortly before he was released. I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that Harold Jones didn't come out of prison and settle down and lead a normal life. And I had an email from a gentleman from Manchester, Mark Buchan Jones. He said he bought my book. He noticed in there, towards the end of the book, I couldn't trace Harold Jones 1963, 1964, 1965. Have you looked at this site? And I googled the site that he gave me the reference to, and straight away it came up Jack the Stripper Murders, 1963 to 1965.
He discovered that after leaving prison, Harold Jones moved to London and lived at the heart of Jack the Stripper's hunting ground. What's more, he discovered that Jones lived only a few streets away from 2 of the victims' homes. But then Neil hit a brick wall. Frustrated by his inability to get anywhere further with this theory that Harold Jones may have committed the Hammersmith nude murders, Neil remembered my own long-standing interest in the story.
of September.
Hello, a message for Professor David Wilson. Hello David, it's Neil Milkins here. I've been doing more research on Darrell Jones and I believe he's committed other crimes. Would you be interested in looking into it further? Hope to catch you soon, David. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
I got Neil's call, so I'm on my way to Abertillery to really test his theory. I'm going to try and identify Harold Jones's signature as a killer and see if this can be compared to Jack the Stripper's. And you know, we can approach this like an old-fashioned case, looking for new leads, testing for the evidence that exists. But one of the things I'm aware about in relation to this case is that there's absolutely no DNA evidence that survived. So we're going to have to look at this also as if it's a 21st century cold case. And to do that, I need to gather a team around me. Most obviously, a forensic psychologist, a pathologist, and perhaps most importantly of all, a great detective investigator.
I received this message from Professor David Wilson, the criminologist, to see whether I'd be interested in helping him as an ex-detective investigator in the case of Harold Jones and whether there was any linkage to the Hammersmith nude murders of the 1960s. I was stationed as a detective chief inspector in the 1980s at Hammersmith and never heard of the Hammersmith nude murders that were only some 20 years before, and therefore they were kind of, you know, quite close. Immediately, you know, looking at the case of Harold Jones, I could feel myself going into that obsessive detective mode. And not only that there were 6 victims who would still have children and relatives where the case of their mother remains unsolved. And there may be a connection, and there may not be a connection, but it's always the search for truth in a police investigation. And I have to start that search in the town of Abertillery.
The murders of Frida and Florence are still a sensitive subject in Abertillery, and I feel it's crucial to hold a public meeting to get the community on side.
Oh, it's a big impact. People talk about it on a regular basis. It's a real subject of discussion. People want to know what happened. They want to get to the truth, basically.
As a child growing up, it was almost like sort of folklore, really, I guess, in our family and within the household.
They were quite close to my house. In fact, the street behind was where the bodies were found. A back lane close to my house is where the murders took place.
I live next door to the house where Harold Jones lived.
My grandmother said there were people in the town that didn't like him. I mean, he would have been 15 when my nan was 18.
I'd like to see justice for the families.
It may be useful, I think, to, you know, trying to piece together those pieces of where he was in those lost years.
Well, it'd be good to come to a conclusion, wouldn't it, really, if he has done these other murders up in London?
I'm actually glad in a way that this has actually been brought up again now. And they can finally come out with a conclusion of finding out who really done these murders.
The meeting is being held at the Metropole Theatre, the same place where an announcement was made about the disappearance of Frida Burnell back in 1921. This evening is the beginning, we hope, of us all working together with you to solve one of the longest-standing murder mysteries in this country. The investigative team that Jackie and I have assembled includes Professor Mike Berry, a forensic psychologist who works for the police as an offender profiler on serial murder cases.
But what I can say is these are the characteristics that would be the most likely ones in this murder case.
And Professor Bernard Knight, the former Home Office pathologist who discovered the victims of serial killers Fred and Rose West at their home at 25 Cromwell Street.
But he made the mistake of putting the knife and the bloodstained carpet up the loft,
which is a bit difficult after you've committed suicide.
We're also inviting members of the community with specialist skills, such as forensic knowledge or experience of police work, to join our team.
My name's Janet and I'm actually a genealogist, and for my sins I used to be a librarian as well. Oh. It's a bit like what happened after the end of a film. What happened after the credits roll up then? To see what he did later.
Janet's genealogy training will prove to be a useful tool to research Harold Jones's background, while Lisa, who trained in forensic science, will also bring invaluable skills.
It's a fascinating way to look at investigation, to get the experts and local people. I think it gives a different insight, and perhaps you look at things in a different way and see different things that perhaps investigators from outside the area wouldn't have thought of.
You were at this advanced CID course and I have been there myself.
Jackie has been approached by retired policeman Chris Clark and Detective Jerry English, who are offering up their extensive knowledge of policing the area where Harold Jones lived and killed.
Being born and bred in Abertillery, we were told as youngsters then about the Harold Jones affair. Not in any great depth, but it was certainly discussed in the family. I mean, I was born in a house approximately 20 yards from where Harold Jones worked, and it was part and parcel of growing up.
Jackie and I have set up an incident room in Abertillery town centre. Jackie, you've been in charge of many incident rooms in your career. What do they do? How are they organised?
Well, murder is the most serious crime that any detective can investigate. It is the search for truth. The incident room is the hub. The crime will be detected from the incident room. It is an intelligence cell, and every bit of information that you gather comes back to the incident room. The first question is, who? Who was the victim? Why was she murdered? Where was she murdered? What happened? When she was murdered? And how? And when we examine each of those questions, we start to build up a picture for our timeline.
And clearly, we know the answer to some of those questions because we know who was killed and we know who killed her. We know that was done by Harold Jones. But in building up our picture, walking in his footsteps, that's very important. I'd like us to get out and actually look at the streets around Abertillery. How can we help the investigation move forward about that?
Well, I'm going to ask Chris. You were a retired detective from around here. Know the streets very well, Chris. Will you be able to work out on the map the route that Frida Bonnell took to Mortimer's store and then subsequently to the place where she was murdered in the storeroom?
Yes, if we start at number 9 Earl Street, Abertillery, we'll come down Combe Cottage Road into Somerset Street, and then it's about 300 yards then from Combe Cottage Road to Mortimer's shop. And when we finish there, if we retrace our steps, and we can go back to the rear of Duke Street where we found, or where the body was found.
What is the distance between Mortimer's seed shop and the store, which is the murder scene?
About 300 to 400 yards.
Thank you.
So we're going to use Chris's map. Let's walk the streets of Abertillery to see if we can build up a picture in relation to how Abertillery fits in or doesn't fit in with what happens in London. Okay, let's go. Whilst much about Abertillery has changed in the passing years, the town's layout has remained remarkably intact. This means the team are virtually able to walk in the footsteps of Harold Jones and that of his first victim, 8-year-old Frida Bonnell. The last day of Frida's life began with her running an errand to Mortimer's general store and grain merchants, where 15-year-old Harold worked as a shop boy.
He was a nice young boy, he was polite. School teachers said they couldn't find no fault in him. His neighbours, everyone painted him as an angel. Around 9:10 a.m. on Saturday, February 5th, 1921, Frida Burnell was asked to go on an errand. She'd gone into the seed store, but he told her that, he said, if you go to the seed storage shed, which is 400 yards away, he said, I can give you that grit. We have got none in the shop.
With Harold's employer, Mr. Mortimer, busy elsewhere in the shop, Harold Jones saw an opportunity to leave the shop unnoticed. He followed Frida.
Harold Jones, we now know, cunningly stayed quite a distance from her so that nobody could say that he'd seen her anywhere near him. He invited her into the shed, he pointed out the bag of grit, and he apparently attempted to rape her, strangled her, bludgeoned her, and did suffocate her with a scarf and left her for dead in the shed.
The team arrive at the site where the seed store once stood. By trying to rebuild a picture of the crime, they are looking to see if there is what criminologists call a signature to it. A signature being something unique about the killer's style and the method of murder that acts as a form of deadly calling card. What do we know about what actually happened to her in the seed store? Lisa, have you got the report?
Well, I've got the death certificate.
And what does the death certificate say?
Well, it says that the cause of her death was shock consistent upon rape or attempted rape and injuries to the vulva and hymen, injuries to the neck and partial strangulation, injuries to the forehead, and shock and fright.
So, Bernard, is she hit on the head as a way of stunning her to gain control over her?
Well, that's the impression you get. It's the final episode, isn't it? The final part of this is being suffocated.
Could we infer that the obstruction of the mouth and nose was to silence her, to keep her quiet? Would that be a fair inference?
Well, we can't tell what his motives were. That's one possibility. Otherwise, he did it as a means of killing her.
And then the rape, would we obviously can't tell from this report, Lisa, but would the rape have been pre or post-mortem?
Again, you can't tell from this. I mean, these examinations are very superficial. You couldn't tell really, but certainly it could be either, or it could be what's called perimortal. In other words, at the time of death, but a minute or two before, a minute or two after. So, you know, it's impossible to be clear-cut.
Jackie, the other thing that strikes me about this is that he has enticed her to the store. He hasn't been seen walking with her to the store. Again, what does that imply for you about the kind of offender we're dealing with?
He's had the foresight to say, you walk ahead and I'll follow you. And it appears that she walks ahead to the store and he said, I'll meet you there. Constantly thinking about what happens if I get caught, or what happens when the police investigate, constantly thinking ahead of the game. Very sophisticated and intelligent.
So far, Harold Jones has shown that he was a violent, sexually motivated murderer, but also that he planned his crime carefully. This was very much a premeditated murder, and totally unexpected in the small community, which launched a huge hunt for the missing child when she didn't return home.
The response was incredible. There was an appeal made in the Metropole Theatre in the evening. There was a play in there, pantomime Babes in the Wood, and information was flashed up on the screen with Frida's details and asking people to look out for her. And then during the night, there were literally thousands of people with lamps all over the mountains and through all the street.
A huge search party combed the countryside looking for Frida, but to no avail, because all the while she lay dead on the floor of the seed store. What Harold Jones did next was perhaps the most heinous expression of his devious mind. As the townsfolk left to search the hillside, Jones moved Frida's body from the seed store and deposited it in the lane at Duke's Hill, just a few yards from where he had killed her.
Here we are then, Jackie. We're at the rear of number 19 Duke Street.
Once again, we're looking for any signature details of Harold Jones's murderous behaviour. She's gone from her own home to buy something for her father, and her body has been disposed of without anybody really noticing until 1 o'clock that afternoon. But crucially, he then brings 3 friends with him when it's dark, and he walks over the body in the dark so as to give him a perfect alibi. What do you make of that?
I find that quite surprising because it's a very sophisticated way of setting up an alibi. Usually 15-year-old boys are very impulsive and just say, it wasn't me, I wasn't there. Kind of the Bart Simpson argument, I wasn't me. But he's actually thought about it, and I think that's quite sophisticated for somebody of his age.
Jerry, you've worked on murder investigations. What do you make of this?
It's very unusual. Not every murder is the same, you know, but a very unusual murder for that period.
And a level of sophistication which is surprising for you?
Very much so, very much so. Very clinical, very well planned. Very well planned.
A local surgeon performed an autopsy on the young girl on a kitchen table as the distraught family looked on. Scotland Yard detectives were drafted in to help with the search.
The police had been to see him in the seed store and asked, you know, if she'd been in there, and he said yes, she was in here. And I sold her a bag of poultry spice. And he said, but I didn't notice when she left the shop whether she went right after she left the shop to go back home or left to go into town. It was about a week later that someone had said to the police, do you know that Mortimer has got a storage shed? It was when they searched our shed, they realised that was the murder scene because they'd found an handkerchief of Frida's on the floor that had come out of her pocket while she was being assaulted by Jones.
Much to the outcry of the locals, Scotland Yard arrested Harold Jones for the murder of Frida Burnell.
They took him into custody, they charged him, and he was protesting his innocence to them and in the court. I know it was all black against me, but I didn't do it.
The trial of Harold Jones made headlines all over the world, but the prosecution's case was dealt a blow when one man was called to give evidence. That man was Herbert Henry Mortimer, Harold Jones's employer.
The Mortimers believed the police were setting up Harold Jones for a murder that he didn't commit, and they were so convinced they were prepared to lie to the police and in court regarding Harold Jones's movements. They both said they could hear him upstairs in the shop working, quite plainly in there.
Mr. Mortimer's testimony was enough to sway the jury and save Jones from jail. He was found innocent of the crime, much to the delight of the people of Abertillery.
A lot of the newspapers reported on it because it was quite a big thing, and he was treated like a hero, and he acted like he was a hero. Flags burnt in, and he was carried shoulder high through Abertillery and presented with a gold watch.
However, not everyone gave Harold Jones a hero's welcome. Frida Burnell's school friend was a girl called Florence Little. Florence lived just a few doors down from Harold Jones on Darran Road. She was seen openly accusing Jones of murder.
Harold, we now know, invited Florence to go into the house with a promise of a drink of pop.
Harold Jones cut Florence's throat. In one final act of cruelty, he then placed her at the kitchen sink, where he drained her body of its blood.
Around 8:30 in the evening, she apparently had vanished. Harold Jones had suggested to the police that were on the scene it would be a good idea to send bloodhounds to help in the search for Florence. He actually went out looking for Florence Little himself till the early hours of the morning with his own father.
Harold Jones had once again been the last person to see the missing child alive. And this time, police weren't prepared to believe his story and immediately searched his house.
When Harold Jones left the house in the morning to go down to the town, the police then entered the house and asked permission to search the house. But when they went to the top of the stairs, PC Cox noticed near the hatch to the attic that there was the wall had been cleaned, and they realised then that there's some reason why that wall had been cleaned. PC Cox climbed up into the attic and he said, "I found the body." Harold's father was told by the police the body was in there. He approached his son and he said, "Harold, the body's been found in the attic." And he protested, "Dad, I don't know nothing about it. I swear I don't know anything about it." And Harold's father said to him, "Well, it's either you or me, son, and God knows I didn't kill her."
Florence's body was removed from the house. Mrs. Ada Minnie Lewis is one of Abertillery's oldest residents and amazingly can still recall events surrounding Florence's demise.
They found a second little girl that he murdered in the attic, and there was a big blood stain. That's where he did the one little girl look. Oh, the funeral was immense. Cram jam full, you couldn't get another person in there. Mind, they did pay him tribute, and they made a big plaque donated by the people of Abertillery, you know.
Harold Jones was once again brought before the court on the charge of murder. Once again, he denied everything.
"I didn't do it," he said, and he kept on saying, "I didn't do it." And like I said, he was at a child's court, so they couldn't put him through what they'd put an adult through.
Indeed, it was the fact that Harold Jones was still a child when he committed the murders that saved him from an appointment with the hangman. Despite calls for his execution, being 15 meant his life was spared. In search of a more lenient sentence, Harold Jones confessed to the murders. But such was the gravity of the crimes, he was detained at His Majesty's pleasure for taking the lives of Frida and Florence. We've been granted access to the house on Darran Road where Harold Jones once lived and where he killed Florence Little. I believe that by revisiting the scene of the crime, even nearly a century later, we can build up a clearer picture of Harold Jones's continued development as a murderer. We've got the actual sink in our photograph where he seemingly drains the blood from her. If somebody gets their throat cut, how much blood is there going to be?
A lot, a great deal. It depends on whether the jugular veins are cut, which is not so profuse, but if the carotid artery is cut, you get a hosepipe effect.
And so the implication would be he cuts her throat and moves her to the sink to drain the blood away. Would that be your interpretation too?
Well, a lot would come out until she died, but at a certain point the heart will stop and therefore the blood pressure disappears and there's no more spurting.
Jackie, this is, you know, a crime scene. How would detectives have treated crime scenes in the 1920s compared to how they would treat crime scenes today?
Yeah. If it was today, none of us would be here, and the only people that are allowed into a crime scene are the obvious crime scene examiners and investigators. Even the SIO would not be here, the police. In 1921, they didn't have that knowledge, and so they would come to the crime scene. It would be basic knowledge of forensic, and no doubt the whole scene would have been contaminated. Not intentionally, but because they didn't know anything else in science.
If the killer wants to escape justice, he's got to find some way of disposing of that body. I think what happens next about how Harold Jones goes about disposing of the body of Florence Little is very revealing indeed. People who go on to kill repeatedly develop methods of murder and fixations with their victims. Those who are most sadistic find a safe place to store the body so as to prolong their warped pleasure even after death. Jones stored both his victims. Those who are most ritualistic take trophies such as personal effects or even parts of the anatomy so they can carry a part of their victim with them at all times. Already I detect such sadism and ritualism in Harold Jones. When Jones was arrested, he was found with 7 ladies' handkerchiefs in his pockets. In my experience, handkerchiefs often excite those serial killers who are aroused with the sensations of smell and taste. I suspect some belonged to his victims, the others to girls he had coveted. More disturbingly, I believe this fascination was rapidly developing into something more sadistic, as was recorded in a letter between Jones and his teenage sweetheart, Lena Mortimer.
You know, when you asked me to spit in your mouth, dear, really, I don't believe I will ever be as dirty as that. So please forgive me for saying so, for you really did offend me then.
Gosh, this is the actual attic where he hides the body of Florence. Come up, Mike, come up.
Oh my gosh. I thought it was going to be a small space, but it's really a big one.
I've worked with killers who kept bodies because they enjoyed the power that they were even able to express over the victim once the victim had died. But I think he's progressed as a killer. I think he's learned from the first murder.
Yes.
And who's to say that that progression doesn't continue in the years and decades to come?
Oh, yes, we both would agree that the killers get better with age, with time. And as you get older, you're less impulsive, you're a better planner.
With the site visits complete, we return to the incident room at Ebenezer Chapel. What have we learned about Harold Jones and the 2 murders in Abertillery? First thing for me is the geography of the crimes and where he disposes of the bodies. There was something about walking those crime scenes that was quite important. What did you make of it?
Well, I think Abertillery must have been a very, very safe town in 1921. Everybody knows each other, and he would know that he would have been seen, had he walked with Frida Burnell, that he said, oh yes, I saw Harold Jones walking with Frida Burnell. But he was sophisticated for a 15-year-old to say, you walk ahead, I'll follow to the store, creating a distance for witnesses not to see them together. He was killing in plain sight.
Jerry, if I could come to you, what did you make of what you've seen in relation to Harold Jones and Abertillery?
Well, today I met the real Harold Jones. I met him, Harold Jones, the killer. Very cold, very calculating, very cunning. And the way that he does everything by putting it in open view of the community, he's throwing down a challenge. He's just brazen in what he's doing. He's challenging authority. You come and get me. I beat you once, you try it again.
The day has given the team a valuable insight into Harold Jones, the boy killer. They now have a clear picture of his signature as a murderer. He is violent and sexually motivated. His victims are much smaller so that he can dominate them. He applied cunning and planning to his crimes. He stored his victims' bodies. He took trophies, and he appeared to have an oral fixation. Our task as a team is to see if this cold, calculating, and cunning killer in Abertillery re-emerges in the 1960s as Jack the Stripper. Our next stop is London. Next time on Dark Son, we examine in unparalleled detail the biggest unsolved serial murder in British criminal history that saw 6 women lose their lives. Using 21st century policing techniques, we try to unearth any previously undiscovered clues the killer known as Jack the Stripper may have left behind. And our search for answers sees a new witness come forward, a man who had his own close call with the killer.
The policeman said at the time that we probably witnessed the murderer.